very warm welcome to this joint event between Westminster Abbey and the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, New York. Here at Westminster Abbey, we have a season this autumn entitled Voice and Verse, which is celebrating the relationship between text and music, largely focused around many of those memorialized in our Poets' Corner. We've had a lecture on theology and poetry. We have workshops for emerging poets. There are song recitals from some of the men in the back row of our choir. But this tonight is a very special event when we'll be discussing together the role of text and context, of the spiritual life, and how the spoken word interweaves with that. So I'm going to introduce now our three panelists, and then we'll get into the meat of the session. The Very Reverend Dr. David Hoyle is the 39th Dean of Westminster, overseeing the spiritual life and giving leadership to the whole Abbey community. Having previously been Dean of Bristol, he was installed as Dean of Westminster on the 16th of November 2019. David's first 2 years here were dominated very much by the experience of the COVID pandemic and its impact on our community. More recently, more happily, he is officiated at the state funeral of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and at the joyful coronation of their Majesties the King and Queen. The Very Reverend Dr. Patrick Malloy joined the Cathedral in the summer of 2016 and was formally installed as the 11th Dean of the Cathedral in December 2023. Prior to joining the Cathedral, he served as the interim Dean at St. John's Cathedral, Denver. He's taught at the General Theological Seminary in New York, where he was Professor of Liturgy, at St. John's Collegeville, at the University of Santa Clara, California, and at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. Marie Howe has published 5 books of poetry, most recently New and Selected Poems with W. W. Norton. She was appointed Poet Laureate of New York State in 2012. She received the 2015 Academy of American Poets Fellowship and was elected as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets in 2018. She's been Poet in Residence at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine since 2020. So to get us going, I'm going to ask representatives of both our institutions to tell us a little bit about their place of worship and the origins of their respective Poets' Corners. So to get us going, I'd like to invite David Hoyle to speak first.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. There's been a church on this site for over 1,000 years. It was an abbey on a rather remote site on the edge of the River Thames. In the 1060s, it became a royal church when Edward the Confessor, the king, moved his palace next door. And what he wanted was a royal church. And that was a defining moment for the abbey. He rebuilt on a grand scale. And we are, and have been ever since, now a royal church, and indeed a place of coronation. Later, this became the place of a shrine. Edward the Confessor was canonized, became a saint. This is a house of memory. There are over 3,000 burials in the abbey. And also there's this extraordinary collection of the great and sometimes not so good who are buried in the abbey. Still very much a working church. And Poets' Corner is something that develops over time.
Perhaps, David, you might tell us a little bit about the origins of our Poets' Corner.
So we have a Poets' Corner because we have Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer is buried, however, and I can see on my screen, I hope you can see on yours, an image of Chaucer's tomb. Chaucer's buried in the abbey not because he was a poet, but because he was clerk of the king's works. He was a royal servant, and he was responsible for various things that happened here. He was also a resident in the abbey community. It's rather late, long after Chaucer has been buried, that the idea that being buried near the poet is a good thing for poets to do. So Edmund Spenser is buried nearby. And then very slowly, we begin to accrete an extraordinary collection of poets, some buried there, like Tennyson and Browning and many others, some memorialized there.
Fantastic, thank you. I wonder if I might ask Patrick the same question. Tell us a bit about the Cathedral and the origin of your Poets' Corner.
I think that our story is slightly more complicated. I was told when I came to the cathedral, and I've since discovered that this is apocryphal, but I think it's a good story to share, that in the 1980s, a priest of this diocese approached Westminster Abbey about honoring an American poet, and you said no. Now, this is entirely apocryphal, but it's very commonly shared, and you said no, and so he came to the then dean of this cathedral, James Parks Morton, and discovered that if Westminster Abbey wouldn't do it for us, then we should do it for ourselves. Again, I think, but it does tell you something about the relationship in the mind of American Anglicans between us and the Church of England, and especially great places like the Abbey. So a decision was made to establish in 1984 our own Poets Corner. And the first three poets, the first three to be inducted were Washington Irving and Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. The stories of that original induction ceremony, it depends on what you read. The New York Times said that there were hundreds. The official cathedral publication said there were 2,000, which is not hard to imagine because we can easily fit 2,000 people in the church. It was a very, very important civic event when the American Poets Corner in 1984 began. But there was before that, 5 years before that, the poet Muriel Rukeyser had started a sort of a ministry here at the cathedral, where in a corner she was given a bulletin board where children could post their poems, but also prisoners could post to the cathedral their poems, and they hung there too. And people were encouraged to take the poems of the incarcerated people away, and then to form pen pal relationships with those poets. The Muriel Rukeyser Poetry Wall. To this day, poets in prisons around the United States send actual paper letters, which is such an oddity these days, actual paper letters here all the time with their poems, which sadly now simply stack up. So the beginning of the Poets Corner here was, as I said, not as simple as yours. It had to do with the Muriel Rukeyser Poetry Wall, and it had to deal with the fact that there was this desire to do something for American writers and poets, whether and we did it here, whether because you couldn't, but in any case, it was emulating you. It was really emulating what was happening at the Abbey.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. And can I just ask you to carry on and explain for us how, in St. John's context, poets are chosen for memorialization? How does that happen? What's the process?
Well, I'm going to ask Marie also to share this with me, but
Yeah.
I know that at the Abbey, the dean chooses those who are inducted, and that's not so here. Here, there's a board of electors who choose the poets, and the dean has veto power. The only time I know of that veto power was exercised when Ezra Pound was proposed. And the dean, because of anti-Semitic concerns, the dean, and I have all the correspondence of people writing to him, the dean squashed that. But I think other than that, I don't think the dean has ever had a direct influence, a very direct influence on the choice of the poet. Rather, it's this board of electors. And maybe, Marie, you could speak to that.
Yeah. It's very interesting. The Board of Electors are serve as advisors to the poet in residence, actually. So we write to them and say, it's time to consider who might be memorialized. And people send in suggestions. For us, it's very American in many ways, because we want a very diverse group of poets and a diverse group of races and orientations of all kinds. So people send in suggestions. The poet has to have left the planet 25 years ago or more. And then they send to me, and I see if there are, a number of people who sort of surface as favorites, and I collect that smaller group and send it back. And then the electors respond to that as well. And then and then from that, I can choose who it will be. Happily, the first person we inducted when I became poet in residence was Muriel Rukeyser. who really was, I think, very influential in creating the Poets' Corner, because she started this bulletin board, and then she and Dean Morton really got together and said there really has to be a place for poetry in this cathedral.
That's a motto. That's a good motto. As Patrick has already alluded, the process in Westminster is slightly different. I wonder whether I might ask David to explain our process and some of the thinking behind it.
It was a rather wonderful thing to become the Dean of Westminster, but there were a number of surprises waiting for me, things that hadn't been in the job description. And one of them was that it is actually the responsibility of the Dean to decide who gets memorialised in the Abbey, which is actually quite a responsibility to have. Generally speaking, we don't ourselves, the Dean doesn't, nominate who should be memorialised. We rely on people to approach us and make a suggestion. And the reason for that is that pushes our responsibility really too far. And people would start to ask quite challenging questions about the choices we make. So we respond to requests. I get a certain amount of correspondence. I have a very large filing cabinet, which contains people who've been nominated, because sometimes what we say is, well, this is a possibility, but let's just see if this name gets a bit more traction. If I get a letter, I have to do a bit of due diligence. I have to find out a little. I know something about number of people who are nominated, but I'll do some background checks. But then I'll also start to consult. So if it's a poet, I would talk to the academy. I talk to professors of English in various places. I might well get in touch with someone like the poet laureate. I'll take advice. If and it doesn't happen too often. Remember, we have an awful lot of memorials in the Abbey already. There needs to be a bit of discretion about just how many more we put in. So I've been here 5 years. In my time, three memorials have been added to the Abbey, and none of those have been a poet. But if I say yes, and a bit like the story elsewhere, we would wait 20 to 30 years before we would say yes. So we're waiting long after a poet has died. If I say yes, then the responsibility for the way this is done, so the design, the wording of a memorial, that's handed over to what we call the Fabric Commission, which is a large group of experts who can tell us what will work in a given space.
Who have your recent inductees been?
We have recently put in a man called Roger Bannister, who's buried amongst the scientists, well, memorialized amongst the scientists, but he's actually very famous as the first man to run under 4 minutes for a mile. We've put in John Gielgud, a very famous actor, and the actors are right on the edge of Poets' Corner, so he's keeping rather good company. And we've put in the explorer Shackleton.
These are not writers.
No, because the Abbey also memorializes, well, we have the burials of kings and queens, we have statesmen and women, we have explorers and engineers, we have architects, so we have a lot of musicians. Purcell is buried in the Abbey, and so is Handel. So it's an extraordinary collection of people.
I understand. I didn't understand this. I thought it was there was a memorial just for writers, but these are
the Abbey's. No, each in their own area. So as you move around the Abbey, yeah,
that's what I did not understand. Thank you. We ought to do that.
One of the amazing the Abbey's collection of burials and memorials is, you know, in the way that poets are gathered by Chaucer, musicians are gathered by Purcell, scientists are gathered by Newton.
Yeah.
It's a real kind of graded ground for so many different facets of the arts, largely, but of science too. Yep. So look, we've already had a bit of name dropping this evening. We've talked about Geoffrey Chaucer and Edmund Spenser, as well as some famous US poets. I'm going to ask some of our panelists now to dig into some examples a little bit more, to share an example of one earlier memorial and one recent memorial, some of the thought processes behind them. Marie, I wonder if we might come back to you on this one.
Yeah, well, the first person to be inducted was Emily Dickinson, which is extraordinary, I think. And her quote in stone is, "Captivity is consciousness, so's liberty." Captivity is consciousness, so's liberty, which strikes me as a very brilliant thing to say about the inner life. And what I've read is that she was elected almost unanimously by the first group of electors who thought Emily, it was between her and Walt Whitman, of course, but I think Emily was inducted first and then Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman's stone says, "Look for me." No, I stopped somewhere waiting for you, because of his great poem, Leaves of Grass. So those are marvelous. They're sort of the mother and father of American poetry, you know, Emily being so deeply internal and Walt Whitman being expansive and inclusive. But the most recent ones, I'm happy to say, have all been women. And Muriel Rukeyser was the first one. I became poet in residence during COVID. So it was a strange time, you know, we masks meeting strangely on Zoom. We did the first one on Zoom. Muriel Rukeyser broke open doors for women and just for consciousness in America. She, on her memorial stone, has a quote that's very famous, which is, "What if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." And after Muriel, we inducted Audre Lorde, a great Black lesbian poet who enlarged the conversation and art of poetic art in America immensely. She wrote many books and influenced many people. And then finally, our last one was Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote Raisin in the Sun and Young, Gifted, and Black. And just so happened that there was a revival of her play on Broadway at the same time that she was inducted. So we're really excited about these three women. And I don't know what will happen next, but it felt important to have sort of voices that had been marginalized celebrated.
Absolutely. And Patrick, is there a liturgical or quasi-liturgical moment when someone is inducted?
There is, though it has varied. There was a time here at the cathedral when we didn't celebrate evensong on Sundays. Instead, they did a service called Vespers, which really isn't an Anglican term, but they had this thing called Vespers, and they were sort of thematic prayer services that were musical and had readings and could largely be secular for that matter. And that's the context in which the induction happened. So it was a sort of a quasi-Christian, quasi-liturgical musical event with reading. We then made a commitment 10, 12 years ago to celebrate evensong according to the prayer book every Sunday night, but they still wanted to do the induction of the poet. And so they created what I consider to be a very unwieldy kind of event where you'd have a reading from the poet and then a canticle and then an essay about the poet and then a canticle, and it just sort of stumbled along and didn't have any cohesion. So the latest iteration, and we've only done this a few times because remember, as Marie said, then came the pandemic, is that we did evensong, perhaps with, if possible, a hymn that was a text of the poet, or we would have scholars of the poet be the readers of the lessons. But then we would all process together from the choir to the Poet's Corner, and then have a sort of a freestanding event at which our choir would sing, but was not part of evensong really was appended to it, but was entirely focused on the poet and the poet's work, and also cultural repercussions of us inducting this poet. As Marie said, like Audre Lorde, for example, they're given our context, that's a very weighty thing to do for lots of reasons. And so we would usually then have a very good lecture about the poet and the poet's cultural relevance as part of that event. And then of course the mandatory wine and cheese.
Absolutely.
And beautiful music. Mhm.
As ever, context is all. We might come back to that a bit later on. I'm going to ask David, though, the same question, whether, David, you might share an example of an earlier memorial that you find particularly resonant, and then perhaps one more recent one.
Of course, I've chosen two very different characters. The first is Robert Browning. I can't claim that Robert Browning is a favourite poet of mine, but in his lifetime, he was extraordinarily popular. He had a massive following, lived and died in Italy. Remember, it's the dean who makes this decision. The then dean, a man called Bradley, is a great friend of Browning, and makes the decision that Browning is in fact going to be buried in Westminster Abbey. That was a decision that was immensely popular at the time. But Browning was a very, very famous poet. We actually have in our library all the certificates that were needed to transport a body all the way across Europe and bring him back into the abbey. I've also seen an order of service which was used at the burial. So that's 1889. Browning, of course, is married to a very famous female poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's predeceased him, and she is buried in Italy. In fact, the burial site that she's in had closed, so Browning's original intention to be buried with her wasn't possible. There was some suggestion that her body might be brought back to the UK as well. That never happened, but Elizabeth Barrett Browning's name was added to Browning's grave in 1906. So we have Robert Browning, and then we have Elizabeth Barrett Browning's name underneath. The other poet is a poet I hugely admire and enjoy, but he's pretty challenging for us, and that's Philip Larkin. He was memorialized, not a burial, in 2016. One of the things you have to decide, I'm fascinated by the quotations you use on your poet's wall. I think that's a very interesting thing. There's a quotation on Larkin's memorial, but there was a bit of debate about what else should be said there. And a friend of mine at the time was part of that debate and remembers the commission discussing very seriously whether it should say Philip Larkin, poet and librarian. In the end, they decided to drop poet and librarian. But what they did put in is those extraordinary final lines from An Arundel Tomb are almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love. And of course, that's Larkin with his tongue very firmly in his cheek, saying, in fact, it's an almost instinct and it's almost true. So it's not true that what will survive of us is love. And Larkin made no secret of, I wouldn't say his hostility to the church. There are marvelous poems about churches, but he's not a man of faith. So he's quite a challenging presence, an interesting man to have.
I'm laughing because he's so difficult. I mean, he doesn't even like life, really.
No, he can be pretty curmudgeonly, but the poetry is just breathtakingly wonderful, and it's deeply honest.
I couldn't agree with you more, David. That's why I'm laughing. I love Larkin. And we need him. He is a human voice, and there's no one in the world who sounds like him. He's an extraordinary poet.
Not long ago, I stood at the memorial. We tend to have annual services where groups devoted to a particular poet will come and lay a wreath and say something about the poet. We've just had the centenary of Larkin's birth, so this was a big gathering, and I gave them some hospitality afterwards. And I had to speak, and I had to say, do you know, as an Anglican clergyman, I feel slightly shifty. I'm not sure what Larkin would make of me speaking. And two different people came up to me, and they both told me the same story, that Larkin had said to them, I'm an agnostic, but I'm an Anglican agnostic.
Bravo.
Jamie, could I just say maybe this should be obvious, but in case it's not, we don't bury anyone in the cathedral. So that is a difference. There are only, other we have a columbarium within our cathedral where we bury hundreds and thousands of people, but the ashes of the people. But I think there are only 3 actual bodies in our cathedral, and they're all bishops. And so none of the inductees in the Poets' Corner are buried, neither their bodies nor their ashes, within the cathedral. That's just to make that point.
But Larkin's body isn't in the cathedral, is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's just his memorial. Yeah.
So interesting, the Episcopal obsession of Anglicanism. If we were obsessed with poets as we were with bishops, we might be in a better place, I wonder. I mean, there's a fascinating relationship between the Abbey and the United States in the 20th century. You know, in 1920, the unknown warrior is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. President Roosevelt is memorialized fairly near to the warrior. I wonder if we might just spend a bit of time thinking about the overlap between our Poets' Corners and what that says about our shared cultural heritage. We often refer tongue-in-cheek to the US and the UK being divided by a common language, but I wonder whether the presence of poets in both of our buildings actually tells us something not just about language, but about a sort of disposition, communication, maybe even the kind of helpful sense that language, even freighted language, can have a doubleness about it, and that language itself also can have a reserve about it. So, Marie, what do you think about this sense of how our 2 Poets' Corners get into a shared cultural heritage?
Well, I'm thinking about who's already the Americans you have, Henry James, T.S. Eliot, and then Auden, who we want. We want Auden too. I mean, all 3 of those writers, extraordinary writers who belonged to both places. And then I think about I can't help but think of the 3 women we just inducted, and Audre Lorde's language, and Muriel Rukeyser, and it seems to me that our work is to include as much of the discourse and dialogue among artists and people as we possibly can. I love that I saw those names in your memorial, and I also love that we all do share this language, different dialects, different ways of speaking, different ways of writing, and that we're all speaking English. We are the part of the earth that speaks English.
Jamie, I'm sure you knew this already, but I've only discovered it lately. Bismarck, the German Chancellor, was once asked what he thought was the most significant event in modern history, and he said the fact that North America speaks English, which is it's a fascinating, and it was a very incisive judgment. I'm fascinated to hear what Marie says and agree. It is noticeable, though, that Auden English goes to America, takes American citizenship, and actually begins to write differently and begins to adopt a slightly different persona. Eliot comes from the US, becomes an Anglican, joins the Church of England, takes British citizenship, and again acquires a rather particular voice. So it's a really fruitful tension between those 2 nations. But these are people who then explore a different identity, I think.
Auden in the East Village, there's that photograph of Auden in his slippers and bathrobe with the snow falling, at the end of his life. It's extraordinary. I mean, I adore Auden. I wish he were here right now to talk with him. But it's true, he became a more American than some Americans. He loved the way Americans talked. He loved all the junk in America, all the slang, all the plastic stuff, and yet he could also speak, he could see into us better than we could see into ourselves. And I think that's part of the marvelous cross current. He could see into what was happening in the American soul, or the human soul, from that place in the United States at that time as well.
It actually had a role to play in our current prayer book.
Oh, tell
So,
us.
well, just that our current prayer book was built with the work of many, many talented people in the social sciences and in language, and Auden was one of those people.
This is so interesting because something similar could be said of Eliot, that although he's an American, he sees very deeply into a certain bit of the rather romantically inclined English soul. He doesn't just
Eliot?
He becomes a very particular kind of Anglo-Catholic. He developed, in some ways, from my perspective, a rather unattractively romantic sense of what culture.
Yeah.
So the crossovers, the doubleness is itself an extremely complex series of cultural knots, isn't it? But perhaps that's how we understand more about what human history is, about what the human being is, what the human person is.
2 empires as well, right? 2 empires, the British
Sure.
Empire and then the American Empire, which gives me chills really right now. And that these 2 empires, people were moving among 2 empires. If the Dutch had won in the beginning, we'd all be speaking Dutch over here, and we don't. We speak English, not British English, but the fact that these 2 places became so powerful, and that we
Yes.
moved among them as powerful people who were, through some sort of fate, luck, whatever, chance, were born into empires. So had the chance to speak, had the sense of, what's the word? The word. They believed they had the right to speak.
Yes. I mean, in discussing empire, we are teetering on the edge of thinking about culture, aren't we?
We are. Yes.
And I wonder whether we might just move on onto poetry itself, what poetry does, why it's valuable. Why is it that the human animal has not been content to simply rest with prose? David, I wonder whether you might kick us off with some reflections on this. Why does poetry itself matter to our cultural heritage?
I knew this question was coming, so I have been giving this some thought. I think it's quite important to say that poetry probably doesn't set out to be useful. So we're not here to celebrate the fact that poetry makes a sort of useful contribution to our life, but it does do something really significant. Trying to put your finger on that, I think, is hard, and I think we might come up with different answers between us. I started thinking about Seamus Heaney, that extraordinary poem, Personal Helicon, where he talks about as a child being drawn to wells, and then as an adult, that's beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to set the darkness echoing. That's one of the things that poetry does. The extraordinary power to give us a truth and a glory that we wouldn't grasp. I thought about an American poet, William Matthews, that marvelous poem about reading poetry at West Point, where people are wrestling there with the fact that his poetry is difficult. And he talks about, I don't want my poems to be hard unless the truth is. So the truth telling of poetry, it in a place like an abbey where words matter, these are people who weigh the words. Poetry has a particular kind of honesty about it, I think. Eliot talks about the fact that a good poet manages to write about what they feel as opposed to writing about what they think they should feel. So that sort of radical honesty about poetry. Those are some of the reasons why I think why poetry matters.
We can't do the same question.
Well, I love this conversation, and I loved what you just said, David. I love thinking about the idea of usefulness coming from a utilitarian country as the United States is. And I think of that poem by Emily Dickinson about a certain slant of light that has the heft of cathedral tunes, and how it heavenly hurt it gives us, but can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. Internal difference is what poetry gives us, right? We read a poem, and if it's a great poem and we're open and we hear the voice of another human, and we're changed. We have an experience in which we are transformed. We recognize ourselves. Something happens, which is why we go to art. It's amazing. So internal difference where the meanings are, I think, is useful, but not in the larger way we usually talk about usefulness. It's the human song. I mean, poetry praises, poetry grieves, poetry celebrates, poetry, seduces, poetry curses, the book of Job. I mean, it's like, and finally, what I love about poetry is that it tries to hold the unsayable. That which cannot be said, and which is what churches hold. That which cannot be said. And when we try to say it, of course, we reduce it to something that can be said. So that it's a container for that. And to me, that is really the most important thing, the most important art. And it's so inspiring to people because it's made out of a language we all use. And
well, this is so interesting. In so many ways, even the most secular of poets is teetering on the brink of the mystical tradition as well as the poetic tradition, I think.
You have to, yeah. If it's a real poem.
This takes us almost full circle, as we began by talking about the particularities of our places of worship, their history, their daily liturgical rhythm. I wonder whether we might just think for a moment together on particularly why we might remember poets in Christian places of worship. What does the context do to that kind of remembering, Patrick?
As I listened to David and Marie, it struck me that poetry has a function of disclosure in a way. I mean, what it discloses can be something that's ultimately ineffable, as Marie suggested, but that it discloses the more. And I think that oftentimes it's quite easy in any religious tradition, maybe especially in ours in the current time, to make religious mystery rather reified and to boil it all down to propositions and social obligations and all sorts of things, rather than to realize that ultimately it's the confrontation with the mystery that then calls forth belief and calls forth moral action. And I think what poetry does is it moves us in that direction. It moves us toward encountering reality with the expectation of discovering the more that is at the end of the day ineffable. And I think that's why having this intersection of poetry and Christianity is so important. And it's no mystery really that there's so much poetry that's woven into it's not that poetry is adjacent to what we do liturgically, but our liturgy is poetic. Our hymnody is poetic. And certainly in our Anglican tradition, at least in the English-speaking part of it, the prayers and the way we pray that Cranmer left us is poetic. It's not pedantic.
And Jesus was a man, a human. My God, why have thou abandoned me? I mean, it's a poem, right? We have this human in the center of everything, this human who was tortured to death.
Yes, extraordinary when a man is being ritually executed in the most painful of ways. Of course, in that context, he reaches for the Psalms, but his voice is the voice of a poet. There's a very substantial patristic tradition which refers to Christ himself as the song of God. You know, we're used to thinking of Christ as word. Christ is also song. His pattern, his pronunciation. You know. David, I wonder if I can ask you the same question. Why poets in a Christian place of worship?
We're a religion of the word. Christ is the word made flesh. The words really matter. Lorca talks about metaphor, the equestrian leap that connects us. Poetry's really good at that. So these are words working hard. I was taught as a young theologian that talking about God is not easy. It was interesting to hear Marie make, I think, a very similar point. Poetry is good, but poetry is tough. And it's the toughness of it, I think, that it bears the strain of talking about things that are difficult to talk about. I talked earlier on about the need for us to reach for the words. And again, knowing that this was coming, I think one of my favorite poets is Louis MacNeice. I don't have Marie's facility for summoning large amounts of poetry up to mine, so forgive me if I read this. If we could get the hang of it entirely, it would take too long. All we know is the splash of words in passing and falling twigs of song. And when we try to eavesdrop on the great presences, it is rarely that by a stroke of luck we can appropriate even a phrase entirely. Now, there's poetry talking about the fact that it's difficult to do this. That's a very good reason for taking poetry seriously, because it will tackle the difficulty.
Mhm.
And perhaps if we were a little more public about that as churches, we might find that people asked us what our secret was. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm just going to throw a few questions around, if I may. The first is a very specific question to our friends in New York. One of our participants, our guests, asks, if the Abbey has people like T.S. Eliot, does St. John the Divine also remember people born outside of the USA?
Oh,
I don't think so. I don't
it's a
think
good
so.
question, though. People who become citizens eventually.
Well, no, that's a different question. That would be an interesting thing to look at, because so many
Yeah.
people in the United States do not begin in the United States. And in that sense,
Yeah.
we're different than Great Britain, the United Kingdom. Of course, everyone who's in the Poets' Corner is an American, but whether they're native-born Americans, that's a different question.
I think that's
Yes,
going to happen
yes.
in the future. I do. I think that more and more poets are on the list of the electors who have come from other countries and recently become citizens. I mean, in the last, decades.
But
Really
this may be the point, though. This question, something that occurred to me that has never occurred to me before, and I'm sad that it hasn't. Is when we were talking about these two countries that share separated by a common language. English is not necessarily the majority language in a great deal of the United States now. And before long, English will not be the majority language here. And I do think, to show part of my political hand, and I think that's part of why our political situation in the United States is the way it is, because I think there are people panicking over that. But I do think that the Poets' Corner has to eventually take seriously that we're going to now have an increasing number of poets who do not write in English.
right. I'm
That's
so
very
glad you
interesting.
said that, Patrick. Yeah.
And so the issue of
Yeah.
citizenship and where one is born, that's going to become even more complicated when the question arises, and what language does a person speak or write in?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one question here which could be read in different ways, but so I'm going to read it in a very particular way. And I'm going to ask this question to Marie, as somebody who is a professional poet. Now, you may not like that moniker. I remember once when I was Dean of a Cambridge college inviting Geoffrey Hill to preach on the power of language, and I learnt my lesson pretty quickly. He came, but he made it very clear how problematic it was for him to be called a poet to preach on the power of language. But Marie, could you tell us how you, as a professional poet, might define or decide who counts as a poet?
Okay,
This is
first
a
of
very
all,
particular question from one of our guests. How do you define or decide who counts as a poet?
all right, you must first of all never use the expression again, professional poet. Never, promise. Promise. Professional brings in all these money and all commodifying everything. This is the question of our time. This is the question of our time. And I'm so glad the person has asked it, because it also speaks to what Patrick was just saying, which was so important. So many voices have not been heard because of the white patriarchal culture that is the basis of our two empires. And also because, you know, opening it's slow and it's well-intentioned, but then you have to listen and learn and talk to people you don't usually talk to. And but more and more, I mean, and there's an explosion of diversity in American poetry right now, and of young poets, you know, and all kinds of language and form. And so thank goodness the dear person has to have been dead 25 years, because if I had to choose among contemporary poets, even with dozens of electors, it would be impossible. But we're trying to bring contemporary eyes to the recent past, you know, and open the lens. And I feel we've been good at that. And it's been so fulfilling to be able to be an instrument in that. But I do think that question is a question for all of us. We have to open our ears, open our eyes, and also get to know each other, get to know the people we don't know who love this poet or that poet or don't. There's just a lot of conversation that has to happen now. And not only English, but there are people in Iran writing and then translating Indian. The whole notion of translation that's affecting you quoted Lorca, David. Lorca opened doors into the American consciousness that had never been opened before. We could not be who we are now without Lorca. He wasn't an English speaker.
Yeah.
It's world poetry now, really. It's world poetry.
When you look back to the late Middle Ages in Europe, you know, there's no question at all that Dante is one of the most influential figures of the late Middle Ages. Full stop. You know, his imagination, his writing influences so much of what people think about God, about politics, about commerce, about salvation. Are there any poets working now, you think, who have that level of cultural engagement?
That's a terrible question to ask me. It's impossible to answer.
Good.
I want to critique your question just a little tiny bit too.
Please do.
Dante he felt he had a right to write and a right to speak. He had what he needed. There may have been great poets around him who had the same talent, but never had the money, the position, the authority, you know, a way of speaking out to the world in that way. So we just always have to say that. There's somebody right now who is a great poet, and we don't know her or him or them yet because they're 14 and they're living in a neighborhood where they don't have a great school, but they're going to come out and they're going to write something amazing. And our job is to listen for them, you know. So I feel as if I cannot answer your question in all fairness to everyone who is alive right now, it would be too narrow. If
That
anybody,
itself is an answer, I think. That
It-
itself is an answer, actually.
yeah,
I'd love to talk more about Dante, because I do think Dante's relationship to privilege is rather more complicated than perhaps you allude, actually.
yeah, I
But
don't mean to, I'm broad strokes, forgive me.
no, not at all. But I love your sense that actually part of the role of society is to learn how to listen, to learn how to allow space for voices that, for whatever series of reasons, have been shut out, silenced, locked away in complex patterns.
A lot of
Perhaps there's
poetry,
just one.
oh, sorry, no, never mind.
No, do go on.
I just want to add one thing. A lot of poetry is being written outside of the university now,
Yeah,
which I think is interesting.
absolutely, and important.
Yeah.
I just want to end with one question which has come in, which is about the question of impact. And again, I think one has to tread on this sort of material very lightly, because it touches on questions of utility and so on and so forth. But I want to ask all of our panelists just to give me a very, very short answer to this final question, which is how you measure on your own heart, I'm asking you as individuals here, how you measure the impact of words on your own heart. We all know the sensation if we hear a sentence which really moves something within us. How do you take account of that? How do you sense that you're going to be changed by something you read or hear? Patrick, can I ask you first?
I I can't really think of anything, a discrete thing that I've ever read that has changed me instantly in a way I can define. I think that the effect tends to be cumulative through repeated reading, and through the way a certain thing then interacts with other things that I've read. I do know that there are times when I read something, be it poetry or prose, that I know that it is changing me, that somehow my perception has been altered, even infinitesimally, by having read that. And I may never again allude to that moment and saying, when I read that, this happened. But I know that it has happened. I know I've been changed. And then occasionally, if I come back to that text, it'll be like returning to either an old friend or a moment of revelation that I had in the past, and I suddenly see it again. So I don't know that that really answers your question. In a sense, it doesn't answer your question, but that's the answer.
That's fantastic. And David?
We write, we talk, some of us preach to communicate, and poetry is communication, and it's one person speaking to another. What will make me sit up, what will move me, and it's the thing that poetry I find does better than anything else. I love poetry. It's the moment when a good poet has named something I know to be true, but I hadn't been able to name for myself. It's that moment that someone's thrown back the curtains, if you like.
That's a
And
great.
that's what I meant, David, when I talked about poetry being disclosive. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And finally, Marie.
Well, I love what both of you are saying. I love that too, that recognition, David. Frost says a poem begins with a lump in the throat, with a homesickness. And I feel like when you read a poem, it's like a kiss or a hug. It's like or a consciousness, like boom, you're touched. It's like you recognize the place. You know it. What did Eliot say? You know it for you've been there for the first time. So there's a sense of recognition and connection, and it enlarges you. Like, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. You know, you too, and we're here. And it's that flash. It just makes everything no matter what, if it's pain, if it's joy, if it's sorrow, it's illuminated in this way that connection, beautiful, that homesickness, you're home for a minute, but you see it for the first time.
The homesickness of a kiss. Thank you.
Oh,
So beautiful.
yeah.
And this treasury of common language which we can share is a remarkable thing. And this evening we've been hugely privileged not just to think about poetry and history, but to consider these questions with Marie, with David, and with Patrick. I've certainly learnt a lot, and all sorts of disclosures have come about, I think, as a result of this conversation. So huge thanks to the three of you for being willing to share your insights, your passion, your critique tonight. Huge thanks also to those of you who've joined us on different sides of the Atlantic and possibly further afield as well. If you've enjoyed this evening, there is the possibility to make a donation to Westminster Abbey, to St. John's Cathedral, and there's also a facility for US residents to make a donation to the Abbey in a tax-efficient way. At the end of this seminar, a screen will flash up to tell you how to do that. In the meantime, before we meet again, all the very best from us here in the UK, and especially at times of global uncertainty, of sadness, of shock, we have not only the gift of language with which to communicate, but the sense that the Word was made flesh, has dwelt among us, and abides with us. Christ, the Song of God, being Word. Thank you for joining us.